Good afternoon. Welcome. Nice to see you here. This is our second LPAC Town Hall meeting in Connecticut. This is a joint meeting between our Massachusetts and New Jersey offices. And we have two special guests, Rachel Brown and Diane Sare, both members of the National Slate, LaRouche PAC National Slate. Rachel Brown is a former congressional candidate. Many of you probably saw her campaign in 2010 against Barney Frank, in 2012 against Joe Kennedy, and she continues to play a leading role in New England in leading the fight for the Glass-Steagall policy and challenging the institutions across New England, including the rotten halls of Harvard University and MIT. Diane Sare, who are also a former congressional candidate who has recently announced her candidacy for governor of New Jersey against Chris Christie. She'll be running as an independent. I'm sure she'll tell you more about that. And this was a courageous decision in response to the recent tragic events that were hit New Jersey and New York by Hurricane Sandy, and the fact that there was absolutely zero leadership and zero commitment to rebuilding that area and to the citizens of that area. So I was thinking a little last night about what remarks I would make today to introduce our guests, and it occurred to me that it was about a month ago that we were gathered here, maybe not the exact same group of people, but it was about 2.5 weeks before the election, and there was a very spirited discussion about what policies we need to shape the country. And there was also a lot of tension about what the election would bring. And we made it clear, and we've made it clear every day in our organizing across the country and the videos on our website and the Friday webcasts, that it didn't matter much who would win the election. Either way, you would get fascism and thermonuclear war. The question was how quickly. So we fought with your friends and your neighbors and your family members, and we told people you cannot vote out a dictator. It's just like you can't just disinvite a cannibal from your dinner table. You should lock them up so they don't eat any more people. So that's what we warned people we have to do with Obama. We have to impeach him. So we warned that Obama would likely try to do anything to win the election, and there was obviously fraud, but it is the fact that the American people did re-elect a dictator. And one of the things that we looked at was the fact that the younger generation, the 19 to 30-year-olds, that was the highest percentage of people that voted for Obama. It was something like 65%. And then as the generations went on, it was less and less. So here we are. Ironically, although Obama was re-elected, and this was a day of infamy, as LaRouche called it, we are now in a remarkable situation which faintly smells like Watergate. So I just want to give people a very brief sense of where we are, what's happened over the last few days, and then I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. There are a number of things that are characterizing the situation that we're in right now. Obviously, most people have seen what's happened with the resignation of Petraeus, just in the last week or so. And LaRouche made the point, but even before the election, that this Benghazi process was underway and there would be no way it could be suppressed. The ball has started rolling. And you saw Petraeus resigned a few days after the election and agreed soon after to testify in a closed-door hearing on Benghazi. As a result, you're seeing Obama is making more and more mistakes. The point LaRouche made last night in his webcast is Obama said the wrong thing at the right time, or he made the wrong mistake at the right time, or something like that. But what you're seeing is a total breakdown and a wave of doom approaching the Obama administration. The darkness is settling in on the Obama administration. And in this press conference Obama gave, he basically welcomed people to go after him for the Benghazi attack. He said, bring it on. And that if Senators McCain and Graham want to go after somebody, they should come after me. So The result of the Petraeus testimony, which I think is really, alarming, but it gives a good sense of what has actually occurred, that one, Petraeus made it clear that the CIA knew immediately that there was overwhelming evidence that this was a terrorist attack by al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists, specifically Ansar al-Sharia. And the other point was that the talking points drafted for the White House immediately after the attack did include specifics about the al-Qaeda affiliations or terrorist activities, but somehow that was taken out of the talking points. So, and Petraeus told them he didn't know why this was taken out. So we have to keep the pressure on. The ball is rolling. But the point is, people have to have a sense. Fox News is not going to remove Obama from the White House, right? These facts in and of themselves are not the truth. The truth of the matter is the principle. This guy has to be removed, and we have to stick to the principle as we organize nationwide in the coming days. Because the point is that although there is this shift going on, the threat of thermonuclear war is very real. And there's been an increasing tension in Southwest Asia. I'm sure people have been seeing some of this. I just wanted to take a minute and read a quick reply that LaRouche had to a question, a message received from Russia, from institutions in Russia, to LaRouche about the thermonuclear war threat since Obama's been elected, which you can find on our website. I just want to read a clip from it because I think it'll give you a good sense of what we're actually dealing with. So the question is, since your country has re-elected a president who is likely to provoke Russia into a thermonuclear war, what advice will you give to us Russians? You know what has been happening at the borders of Russia is exactly what Hitler did before he attacked our country. You know we will not militarily hesitate to preemptively or retaliatorily strike back against your country's aggressive moves against Russia. What kind of geopolitical agreement and politically stabilizing level both of our countries can come to an agreement? Ever since Obama was elected into office, all of our nuclear regiments are placed on alert, and a certain portion of our key population, essential for our COC system, continuity of civilization, has been evacuated along with their immediate families to our underground COC facilities. So this is very real. This is very real for the Russians. Now, LaRouche responded, "Your description of the perceived threat to Russia is better than merely fair. But what you need is a true identity of the enemy. This requires the indispensable knowledge of the actual British, now Saudi British, world empire. That necessary knowledge has been usually absent among most of the present leaders of the nations of the world. Even our own United States, since the 1763 18th century Peace of Paris, which established the British Empire as a de jure new world empire, and which consolidated that British imperial system through the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, which was crafted through the schemes of Britons Castlereagh and Metternich, often fails to recognize it. It is important to emphasize for your purposes here that an empire is the superior power which exerts top-down authority over a collection of subject, nominally nation-state entities. The British seizure of control over the financial economy of the United States with the inauguration of the British puppet regime nominally under the puppet President Andrew Jackson wrecked the institutions of the United States repeatedly thereafter, leading to a recurring seizure of control over the government of the United States, a control which was periodically aided by the British Empire's numerous assassinations of presidents, such as recently John F. Kennedy and his brother, the prospective President Robert Kennedy. So this is what we're dealing with. And this is who is starting the tensions and who is behind what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. It's what's behind getting people in the United States to accept the fascist budget-cutting austerity policies that Obama is ramming through. And so this is what we're dealing with. This is the enemy. Now, there's a number of details on what what's happening in the Middle East, I think the most clear thing is what happened over the last few days in Israel. Netanyahu ordered the assassination of Ahmed Jabari, and in an open attack, and Jabari was the highest official killed in 4 years. And his murder drew the response from Gaza of massive rocket and mortar fire into Israel. So you have tensions building there. We have in Jordan, there have been riots and demonstrations in protest of the government cutting subsidies on fuel, and gas prices have went up by 54% overnight. And there's numerous other things, but this is all happening in the context of a total blowout of the international financial system. What you're seeing in Europe, what you're seeing in the United States. And I think, what's clear is that, what Obama is talking about in terms of this so-called fiscal cliff that we're approaching is a totally arbitrary, fabricated term to get people to accept massive budget cuts. And the automatic cuts are supposed to go into place in early 2013. This was the result of the Super Congress of last year not coming to any conclusions about where we're going to cut. So regardless of whether they came to a conclusion, the budget cuts would come into place anyway. This is fascism. It's clear that we have increasing, deteriorating living conditions in the United States, typified by the destruction of New York and New Jersey, and the lack of commitment to rebuild that area. And now Diane and Rachel will both discuss more on this, but it's important to keep in mind these financial decisions that involve numbers and money and budgets, the real intention is to carry out genocide against the population. And that's what you're absolutely seeing. It takes various forms, whether it's the people in Rockaway who have not yet gotten their electricity, and the people who are going to be cut off the social programs when these budget cuts come into place. And the other aspect, which is very clear, is the cultural collapse that happens when there is a sense of hopelessness, when people don't have a sense that their leadership is actually fighting to represent them. And you're seeing this in Spain, where there's been an increasing reaction in the population to the situation there. And so this is what we're dealing with. Now, LaRouche, luckily we have LaRouche, and we have a movement that's actually fighting this. And it is the case that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with the collapse of the Obama administration. As he makes more and more mistakes, the ugly hide of the British Empire is exposed. So our role here in this room and other gatherings like this around the country is to very quickly replace this rotten, destroyed, collapsing system and reverse the trends of the last 30 years before it's too late. And this is why I think most of you are here today, to do that. So in that note, I would like to present to you the leaders in this crisis. Here, Rachel Brown will speak first, and then Diane Sare. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I would like to put your minds now in the field of someone who is, as you met us, behind the book table. Because all of you walked up and you saw us, or you pulled over, you saw our pull over, stop Obama sign, and you pulled over and you were moved. Well, you're not the only ones that are out there thinking that, believe it or not. What we have right now is an infinite ability to recruit the American population towards a future and back to the Constitution. And that is what we're seeing right now with this reaction around Obama and the Benghazi cover-up. The cover-up of the cover-up of the cover-up, as LaRouche, said, it is unraveling. The yarn is being pulled and it's unraveling. And this is a Watergate situation, a Watergate-type situation. And nothing certainly is determined right now. It's not determined, but it's moving in the right direction, and we in this room are a central part of that process playing out. We began it. It has to do with the failure of the party system to represent a solution. As we were told, it was the reason why the Benghazi case is coming out, besides the fact that we produced the documentation beginning on September 12th. We produced the documentation, mass distributed around the country, the various eyewitness accounts that there were no demonstrators, the president of Libya, all the statements that were necessary to make the case. We distributed en masse, as well as in Washington, D.C., to our network of contacts. And this was later reprinted in the Washington Times about a week after the attack happened. When people remember then, it started to snowball. So the courage for the political leadership, the retired military that came out, was due to us being out there and creating this field. So that's number one. That action was begun by the intention of LaRouche and a number of hardworking, passionate individuals to create that change. And so then secondly, you also had a response from people in the Republican, maybe say, you could call it the Republican Party, but maybe they're not so happy with a lot of the Republican Party right now. And they said, well, we're not so satisfied with Romney, and we're a little worried about some of the influences in the party. We're going to take matters into our own hands. And you saw people of that type joining into the Benghazi mission and putting out their version and their version of the intelligence and calling up their people and encouraging them to speak out. So that this is a reaction that's lawful. That's lawful when a principle such as our Constitution has been fought against for decades. It's a lawful reaction that you're going to have the best minds in the country that want to save it, that are going to join together to do that in a time like this. And we're really driving that. So, yeah. So we do have, as I said, infinite potential right now. And I don't think we should limit ourselves to thinking about the next 10 years as we have the last 40 years. I don't think we should limit that, because we are at a point of breakdown of the system. Now, a lot of people in this room have experienced that for a while. It's been a breakdown of a system. This is the end. This is the end of that last system. And as Jenny was bringing up with this fiscal cliff, that's an indication of it. When they say, well, we can do nothing. Is this? I don't know if I even need to use this. Okay. Yeah, when they this whole story about the fiscal cliff. As Jenny said, this is a manufactured crisis for one. I remember the Y2K, fiasco. Supposedly we couldn't solve that problem, that our computers wouldn't turn over. I was in 5th grade and I thought it was crazy, But this is the same type of thing. But what's really behind the whole fiscal cliff, discussion is an intention not to just cut our budget or appease Wall Street or something, but it is an intention to destroy the country. That's the idea. Get people to swallow the pill that will destroy the country. And it clearly won't work. What you're seeing happen in Europe is a total disintegration. There's essentially no sovereignty left in Europe. There's no nations left in Europe, Spain, Italy. There's no semblance of it. They've given over their government to the EU, the Troika, the IMF, the ECB, so not a nation, to a financial international establishment that's seeking to destroy nations. And what's happening in Greece right now is coming here. That's the exact policy that is intended to be imposed by this, by the cuts that Obama is trying to put through on behalf of the, the fiscal crisis. That's the real intention. So as we've been discussing with the platform that we're out there on the streets organizing around every day, is the way out, is the scientific, is the policy based off of the scientific principles to put the future into action now. And I don't think it can come also just from a, digging out of the past. The way we're thinking in those regards is too small too. It's not going to be just cutting here and a few jobs there. That's just simply not enough. Since we're at the end of the system, the natural way out and the only way out is to act on a new system that's not into play yet. Things like space, Arctic development, things that are going to require technologies and skills that we might not fully have yet. We have some of them. We have a lot of people that need to work, but they're going to be taking up certain challenges that mankind has never done. And then we can actually inspire a new generation of young people in the universities to take up science. Yeah. Right. Yeah. People would rather be a massage therapist than a scientist, or, sports or whatnot. But right, if we actually put this system into motion now of the future, the next step, the one that we avoided, this has to come into play now, and that's what's going to inspire people. That's what's going to move people out of this crisis, not looking to the past. The past is dead. Okay.
Is there a fiscal cliff or isn't there?
There's not.
There isn't?
No. No.
So then the $16 trillion debt that has been projected with respect to all of the programs that people have paid for, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, and Social Security are erroneous.
Right. Yeah. In a sense, yes.
Well, then if that's the case, then why are we borrowing 40 cents on every dollar every day we spend if there isn't a fiscal cliff?
Well, we're borrowing it from ourselves. We're borrowing it.
Well, in essence, yes. We're borrowing from China and we're doing some creative thing to really buy it back. And I understand all that. But you can't legitimately stand there and say that the government can sustain spending $2.2 trillion a year when it's hypothetically when it's only taking in 1.2 trillion. So there is something wrong.
Right, there is something wrong, and what you said is actually the essence of the matter. What we're creating is less than what we're putting out, right? But the problem is not thinking about it in terms of just simply a monetary aspect, a financial aspect, but a physical process. That's the real question. And I mean, it's a simply solvable. The problem is easily solved. Sorry, I apologize. Yes, it's easily solved.
Well, then why am I qualified as not?
Because of that darn media and those people that want
That doesn't even exist.
that keep you from wanting to think about,
But I'm kind of
to know the real way out.
How LaRouche Act is going to solve a problem when in this last election, the vote count should have been 10 votes Obama, 400 million.
Mhm.
Well, you got to convince me what LaRouche can do that wasn't done in the last election.
Right. Yeah, let me just get through a few things, and then we actually can take this up in a discussion process at the end a little bit. We should go through a couple things, and then we can do a Q&A. But I think what I was bringing up at the beginning is way more important than the election. That's the point. You can't expect the masses, most often, to do the right thing. Especially over the last 40 years. They've voted for the destruction of the country. They voted again for the destruction of, they voted, right? That's not the way out. And that's not how history is made. History is made by a few people willing to act and that have the guts and the courage and the intellect to flank the enemy. because we do have an enemy, and we need to discuss that too, which is the British Empire. And that is collapsing right now. Its power structure is collapsing. Its ability to carry out a war is collapsing. Its operations are coming out into the open, as Jenny referenced. Everything that Obama does right now, he's actually exposing more the operation that's behind him. Now all of the so-called, terrorist networks, well, actually we forget now whether they're terrorist networks or our friends, I mean, all of this is pointing more and more to the system that Obama's part of, and it's losing its insidiousness, because that is how it acts most strongly, is when you're not aware of its presence. And so now and we also just produced this 9/11 special report, which we've been getting out throughout Washington, D.C. I don't know if people have had a chance to look at it, but it's the most comprehensive thing on this British Saudi network, that's ever been produced. We just got it out to every member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee this week. So they're acting on this knowledge in their investigations now. There is a official Senate committee being formed right now, or call for it, which is, the process that took Nixon out, is for a Senate Select Committee to do a full investigation. Could be from both houses. I mean, that's the important thing right now. It's not the people that were duped or the votes that Obama stole, because obviously that's a huge factor as well, right? So so what? The election didn't work. On one hand, also, it's actually better to impeach the guy, because he deserves it. Yeah. And then we can actually clear our country out of this pessimism. So, yeah, I just think that. But I also wanted to bring up a couple instances, maybe not in a whole lot of too much detail, but the fact that every time we've actually had an enemy operation within our government, they've actually always said that there's a fiscal crisis. And every time that we have acted, with economic prosperity, it's been when we had governments which acted on a credit system, not worrying about their current expenditures, but worrying about what they were investing into, whether they're investing into canals, infrastructure projects, and things that they knew were for the next generation. It was a very explicit policy fight in the history of our country, starting with Hamilton. And there was just a New York Times article, which is just interesting that this is being discussed now. We've been saying it, but Hamilton founded this country on a credit system. He founded it on debt. But he said that debt was a blessing because it tied up the interests of every state into a process for the future, where instead of each state saying, I've got this much debt, you've got that much debt, what are we going to do? You're going to cut, we have to cut expenditures here, cut expenditures there. Wow, you don't have any debt, you're lucky. Instead of having that, they pooled it into a national debt, and then it was therefore the duty of the federal government to employ the means to extinguish that debt. And so the interest of every state was tied up into the interest of the development of the nation. And they also got the private investors to invest into the national bank. So you actually had the private citizens, the people who had their money and they wanted their protect their money. They were also tied up in the interest of the development of the nation by the founding of the national bank. So Hamilton, instead of saying, well, we've got debt, we can't spend anything, to help establish, New Hampshire or something. New Hampshire has debt. Well, poor New Hampshire. No, he didn't say that. He said, well, we're going to establish the means to develop every single state and every part of our territory as a nation, because he knew also what we were up against in terms of the British Empire. So that was one time where we fought the austerity policy, and that was establishing the foundation of this country. Secondly, the time where it was claimed that we had to cut expenditures, secondly, was after Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren came into the presidency and illegally took down the Second National Bank, vetoing the act of Congress to keep the national bank going, and illegally withdrawing the funds as president, took the funds out of the public bank, national bank, and gave it to private people on Wall Street and to his buddies on Wall Street. And then you had an economic collapse, and he said, well, what we're going to have to do now is cut the budget. Yeah, so you had that case, and you also had a similar thing around Coolidge and Hoover after the killing of McKinley and the building up of the Wall Street speculation and the shutting down of our developed, productive economy around that time. You had the same claim, a $3 billion limit, cap on expenditures, no infrastructure building. Then Hoover started using the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to give money to the banks, which didn't do anything. So you had the money printing policy. And he said, we can't spend, we can only give money to these banks because they're insolvent, and banks are good for the country, so we should help them. Same like now. Didn't do anything, right? Economic collapse, depression. Only when Roosevelt came in and used the RFC, instead of giving money to the banks, but gave money to the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the development projects around the country, were able to use that same amount, that same credit source as a multiplier effect for the real economy, to create the jobs, the electricity, the water, the farming, and actually create the biggest economic boom the world had ever seen. Yes, aided by the World War II, but that's not the necessary principle. We need the same type of war mobilization now for a development. You can employ that same type of economic thrust with a space program, with rebuilding, with building the storm protection that we need to. The Army Corps of Engineers has only $650 million for a one-year budget for the 14 Northeast states is what the Army Corps of Engineers has. And that's for all of their programs, for irrigation, water sanitation, storm defense, coastal rebuilding. And that's for 14, most populated states in the country. So there are plenty of projects of that type, number one, to invest in, but then also to think even bigger with these questions of space.
We have to educate the people about they're not doing their job, and also get on the facts about doing their job.
Heck yeah.
We know what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah. The more the better.
So use those things that just to keep generating itself.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Let me just say a couple more things, and then we're going to get to Diane, and she's going to talk about some of this some more. Actually, just real quick. So here's what John Quincy Adams said about the same idea. He was talking about the takedown of the bank, the national bank. He wrote a paper on it, which the Congress refused to hear, and so he printed 500 copies of it and distributed it anyway. But he said that, with the coming in of Jackson and Van Buren, and they cut down the bank, and then they lowered taxes, and they cut the public bonds for development of canals. They said, well, we don't want to, the government shouldn't do anything except for, worry about the present. It needs to just, carry out the immediate functionings, and therefore it should have no role in things like a public corporation to build canals. So Jackson ordered the funds to be taken out of the public canal building, and he said, well, now we can lower taxes. So you'll get more money now to the people, right? The people loved him. He was a man of the people, right? But the real intention was to destroy the ability of the nation to develop, to keep it as nothing but a, Southern-style puppet of the British. So what John Quincy Adams says in response, he said, well, I'll just read it. It says, the system of internal improvement, promotion of domestic industry, which from the close of the last war with Great Britain had been pursued until the present administration came into power, will be abandoned. And as they offer in its stead the remission of taxes, they will in all probability be supported by the people. The control of the central government over the separate states will also be abandoned, and the powers of the judiciary prostrated. The entire discharge of the national debt will dissolve one of the strongest ties which held the nation together, and the doom of the National Bank at the expiration of its charter already sealed. Of the two systems, that of the present administration sacrifices the future and remote benefit to the present, and therefore addresses itself more to the feelings and prejudices of the people. But so just that contrast between the present and the future, the idea that economic value really only comes from an intention towards the future. There's no value in money as an immediate, means immediate circulation mechanism, unit of trade and sale. Money really does not have value in that, but its value really is in this question of the employment by human creativity to create a more productive state of functioning. And that actually has been an express policy in our history, and that's what's in our platform here that we're getting out. As I mentioned, around the country, every day. Okay, so that's the main idea, and I'll just add in one thing about the bigger principle of this is the principle of the human mind really being the most powerful source in the universe, of creating new states, creating new ideas, employing a new idea. Because it's not just simply the development of the productive powers of man wasn't just from wood, as a source that helped us be productive, versus coal to oil. Each level of energy made us more productive. We were able to do more, have more energy per person with less effort. But it was more a development of the states of mind of the population. It was a development of new ideas, of a new condition, a new idea. Societal, a new idea for the current society, for man as a species. So that's the real idea that we've got to think about, and all of this stuff on the media is it really creates pessimism because it destroys your ability to imagine, to have imagination, and that's where this true value really comes from. So that's what I'll start with, and then we can have some discussion after Diane, more Q&A.
All right, well, in a sense, I feel like some of what I'm about to present is on a lower plane than what Rachel is addressing, but I think it'll be useful. Because the question is, how do we save the nation and how do we mobilize people to do it? And I think obviously people who came here are here because you think that something different has to be done. And a lot of people that you meet think that things are bad. But I think that one of the hindrances is that people don't realize how bad things are and how little time we actually have. And I could have picked any number of examples. Jennifer gave you a sense at the beginning of this World War III question when you heard the question from the Russians of their view of the danger of thermonuclear war. There's a lot more on that. We could have a discussion of the danger of food shortages and the fact that in California right now, which produces 20% of our dairy, at the dairy farmers rally in San Francisco, we spoke with people from Wells Fargo Bank who said they expect a third of the dairy farmers to be bankrupt within 2 months. They're getting paid right now per hundredweight of milk what they were paid in the 70s. And everyone knows that the cost of everything is, I don't know what, 5 times, 10 times, whatever it was in the 70s. So they're going under. We don't have corn thanks to drought conditions. We have massive speculation on the price of wheat right now. So that's a real threat. And there's other things that are threats, like the question of asteroids, which were due for an intersection with another one now, just statistically speaking, sometime in the near future. We've had a number of near misses lately, which, you know, Obama wants to shut down the space program, so I guess we'll just blindly wait for that. But what I wanted to look at, which is somewhat close to home, is what this hurricane actually did and what it means, and to look at it from the standpoint of what our nation actually should be doing if we were sane, if we had leadership and we functioned in a rational manner. Now, it's interesting because thankfully, in spite of Obama, we do have some satellites. So the forecasts of where the hurricane was going to touch down were quite accurate. And the timing was quite accurate. But our infrastructure was not. So for those of us from Jersey, Rachel knows, and Jenny, because a number of us were refugees in Boston for a while because we had no electricity, couldn't flush the toilets in the office. The cell phone towers were down, so you couldn't even communicate with people. Maybe you could get a text out, you couldn't call people. And that was in northern Jersey, near our office is near the Hackensack River. Luckily, we weren't a little farther down where the river breached a couple of levees and 2 towns just got completely wiped out. At any rate, it was not pleasant and it was difficult. And when I would call the people who stayed in Jersey to work on our, well, they weren't in the office, but one house out of about a dozen or 15 homes that are of our coworkers had electricity. So everyone packed over into their living room, tried to do something. And what you could hear is that people were getting more and more worn down and stressed out. You couldn't find gasoline, all the food went bad, people had medication, they didn't know where to keep it. It was a mess. Now, we got our gas back, we got our electricity back and are somewhat functional, but in the state right now, you still have 30 to 40,000 people who are totally homeless from the shore. They reopened the Monmouth base, and that they said would hold maybe 400 to 600 families. That might be 2,400, 3,000 people. That leaves another 27,000, 37,000 people. They're saying these homes in areas are not going to be rebuilt for 18 months or 2 years or longer. The Rockaways, they said they're incapable of receiving electricity now, so we're no longer going to count the number of homes that don't have power because it's been determined that they aren't capable of receiving it now. So you're just writing off whole sections of New York, you know, like Bangladesh or, you know, Colombia or whatever, Malawi or some third world country. Now, I just wanted to show you a few pictures of this. And this is Tuckerton, New Jersey. There used to be a town there. It's now all underwater. Next. This is the famous Breezy Point where all of these homes burned to the ground because the firefighters couldn't get in. I forget how many, 100 and something or other homes just gone. And you can see the water sort of coming up. Someone's walking their dog down there. Next. The New York subways, which had not flooded in the 108 years that they were built, for which we don't have parts because we no longer produce the parts in the United States. So there are sections of this that may not be repaired. They may just have to leave it, or if they do repair it, it's going to take a really long time. I don't know, how long does it take to build a factory? I mean, it's third world conditions, and it's insane. Now, our nation didn't used to always have this kind of unbelievable, rotted out infrastructure or lack of leadership. Next. Under FDR, and there may be people here who remember this, in 1938, there was a huge hurricane that hit New England with devastating force. And there was a really useful little film put out, I think put together by some of the people from the WPA, and it's really something to look at this and contrast the response, even when we didn't have the same degree of machinery and technology in 1938 that we have today, but the fact that we had a workforce who could mobilize and respond to this. So if you want to, yeah. Now you have to click that twice and go to the third minute, or 3.5 minute. I want to turn out one of these. There we go. That's fine.
With communication cut off, the full extent of the disaster was unknown for days. The nation waited fearfully for meager bulletins bearing sad tidings. On the watersheds of New England, the storm brought new torrents, the rivers already gorged after 3 days' downpour, and so flood was added to the burden of the hurricane. Sweeping down from their headwaters in the high mountains, swirling rivers rose to levels rivaling the disastrous floods of 1936, increasing the difficulty of removing refugees and of carrying food and help to the stricken area. The great dam at Holyoke was a cascade of thundering water as the torrent poured over its crest. Hartford was one of several cities along the banks of the Connecticut River to be partially inundated by rising waters. An immediate result of the storm was the complete disruption of transportation. Bridges were washed out, roads were blocked. Beneath the water in this low-lying underpass are an automobile and the bodies of its 2 occupants who were trapped. How to get necessary food and medical supplies into the storm zone became a major question, but local relief agencies went into action at once, and the task of rescue began. Neighbor hurried to assist neighbor. Private citizens volunteered to aid police, civic agencies, and the Red Cross. All available boats were drafted into service. Family after family was rescued when rising waters threatened their brief security. True to their tradition of alien service, the Coast Guard met the emergency with swift action. From the coastal islands, some of which were completely swept by gigantic waves, Coast Guard boats brought survivors to safety. Further inland, armies of workers from private relief agencies, from nearby WPA and NYA projects, from CCC camps, as well as men recruited from every branch of the military and naval services, erected sandbag barriers to halt the rising waters. Were temporary expedients, but elsewhere the rivers were held in check by flood control projects completed by the WPA since the Great Flood of 1936. On the Nashua River at Pittsburgh and on the Connecticut River at West Springfield, these new structures proved their value beyond question. In 3 days, an army of 110,000 WPA workers had been shipped to emergency storm and flood duty. Every little man with a pick on this map represents 1,000 workers of the WPA. Manpower turning from regular public improvements and services into the breach in time of dire need. Where tracks remained to carry trains, thousands of these workers came by rail. Shock troops of disaster, someone has called them, because so many times in recent years they have provided the human sinews for great tasks of reconstruction. As the work of salvage began, sailors from Navy yards and soldiers from Army posts aided civilian police in maintaining order. Part of the army of WPA men worked feverishly, helping to locate those trapped or lying dead beneath fallen debris. One man was found alive under 8-meter wreckage 40 hours after the storm had passed. As New England rallied to the worst disaster of its history, WPA Administrator Harry Hopkins flew from California to Providence, the only transportation in the stricken area. He made a quick tour of the ravaged area to plan with New England leaders the task of cleaning up, as well as the 6-month job of rebuilding public facilities. Administrator Hopkins met with the governors of the storm-torn states pledging the help of the federal government. Women workers of the WPA, along with the Red Cross, provided comfort for thousands of refugees. At Chicopee, Massachusetts, in an infirmary also built by relief workers, they cared for families left homeless by the storm and provided nourishing meals for children whose own homes had not yet been made habitable. Sewing rooms like this one prepared warm, dry clothes for all the needy. Every emergency unit, local and federal, swung into action to distribute food to the hungry. Trucks were commandeered to deliver food, clothing, and surplus commodities to the entire population in the hurricane district. Food centers throughout the stricken area supplied families with provisions which could not be obtained elsewhere. Convenient centers were set up for the distribution of clothes donated by the Red Cross, those in the WPA sewing rooms. Many of these badly needed garments were shipped from the sewing rooms of neighboring states outside of the hurricane district. Warm clothing helped to check the danger of serious illness. Stubbornly, the ghastly wreckage of the storm gave way, and the realization came that it would not be days, but months before normal life could be resumed. Women clung pathetically to their household treasures. Men did the heavier work and tried to save what they could. In many towns, like this one in Rhode Island, tons of mud and sand washed over the main highway. All of this had to be cleared away before the paralyzed villages could make any headway toward recovery. Food for these workers was a major task in itself. Every truck not otherwise employed was pressed into service and loaded with food for consignment to various emergency projects. These groups of men working shoulder to shoulder were gathered from every sort of work project, and they stopped their grueling labor only long enough to refill their systems with sandwiches and coffee. But man needed the help of machinery in his task. Huge sections of broken homes, roofs, whole wings, porches were dragged to open fields to be burned. These were the well-built homes of peaceful New England, destroyed by the awesome power of a tropical hurricane. Every saw in the storm area bit deeply into fallen giants that had been a feature of the beauty of New England. Here youthful NYA and CCC workers vied with older men. Trees were down everywhere, across streets, on telephone and telegraph wires, on houses. And New England could not get going again until they were cleared away.
Anyway, so it's just worth thinking. I mean, 110,000 people were there within 3 days. And within actually 2 months, most of the worst of things had been cleared up. Now you look at what happened in New York and New Jersey of a population area of 20 million people. The areas directly hit by full force of the hurricane are 1.4 million people. What I know of is in New Jersey, we had over 5,000 private utility workers come in to help the power companies there from the entire nation. It took a week or more. The people who turned the power back on in our office were from Wyoming and Utah. And all they did was they just desperately were trying to get people back on as quickly as they could, and now the regular power companies are going back in and people are losing power for a few hours or a day or two while they're redoing everything to get back on the grid that we had before. 5,000 people is nothing, and maybe 7,000 Army Corps who went to Manhattan, and I don't know how many other private utility workers came into Manhattan. So you're looking at maybe, if we were generous, 20,000 people to come into the New York metropolitan area after a storm of this magnitude. And I know for a fact, because there is such a shortage of manpower, you don't have people even in the neighborhoods. Like one of my coworkers, next door neighbor, was calling the Red Cross because she had $5,000 worth of medications in her refrigerator which were destroyed, and she had no way to get to replace it. And there is no one going door to door through all of these apartment buildings where people are terrified to come out because it's dark. They have no running water. They're dumping their sewage down the stairwells or out the window. They don't have food. And there's no national mobilization to address this on the scale required. It's criminally insane. Next, after that, yes. So we have this. We have this trio. um, and they're all nuts. I mean, I don't know if people saw the Saturday Night Live spoof on this. It was pretty funny. They had Bloomberg with his interpreter telling people to not take out their agony on drinking 20-ounce super sweet drinks. Bloomberg then endorses Obama. Why? Because Obama really understands the threat of climate change. Bloomberg doesn't want to build the infrastructure that, and you saw how important it was that in the flood of 36, they had built up all this levees and dams and gates that could be closed on rivers sort of in the mid-Northwest, so that when the hurricane hit, they were able to employ these things so we didn't have more water coming in from the rivers while we were trying to clean up the hurricane. So all the infrastructure that was built served a very useful purpose, but Bloomberg doesn't want to give people a false sense of security by showing that man can conquer nature, so we should not have any sea gates. Christie and Obama are having their love fest. Christie is a total proponent of green energy, windmills and solar panels, and I can tell you that none of those things work in a hurricane at all. And of course, Obama flew in on a publicity stunt so it could look like he cared about someone, and left. And then he just came back again and went, I don't even know, they supposedly went to the Rockaways. I have a hard time imagining that they could go there without having something horrible happen to them. I mean, it really is a shame. I mean, it's an embarrassment. Yeah. 12, oh yeah, exactly. They made a decision that he could, yes, that's true, that's true. But I mean, it really, and you see, this also is a problem with the party system. With these guys, you have the worst of the parties, the green policy and the austerity. Also, they said that it wasn't really worth investing the money. There was a conference, and I'll show you some of the projects. They estimated that you could have built a storm surge barrier for New York Harbor, which would have cost about $6.5 to $7 billion. What is this going to cost us in terms of human life and what's been wiped out if we even rebuild? And so now I just want to remind you of a few things that our nation actually has done. The Hoover Dam, the construction was begun in 31 and then completed in 36. If it were not for this, a huge chunk of California would not have water. We wouldn't have all of the produce that we have there. It's actually been very effective. We need to build Nawapa because the Colorado River is now getting a little low and it's getting heavily mineralized, but we can address it. Next, for people who like to think big, this is the Three Gorges Dam in China, which works. It's functional. It's very large. Okay, next. Now, this is one of the proposals. I guess that's Manhattan. That's the Verrazano Bridge from Staten Island across to Brooklyn. And back here is a project by a firm from the Netherlands named Arcadis. And this is the gate which allows passage of large vessels and ocean water and so on. And when you have a storm, you just close the gate. This is modeled on some of the barriers that they have in the Netherlands that have been very effective. And then this, since it's just across the Narrows, they say you would need two more, one farther south in New Jersey by an area called Arthur Kill, which would be a surge protection barrier of another riverway into Jersey, and then another one up, why am I blocking out where it is? But anyway, it would be a system of three of these things, and basically you'd protect this whole area. Next. This is the one I really like because it's big. It's, I think that's sort of American, which is all the way from Sandy Hook to the Rockaways. So just the whole area. It's a 5-mile-long barrier. I don't think I put more pictures of it. This is by an American company called Halcrow. They just built a huge system for St. Petersburg, which, as people may know, has tons. It's a whole series of islands. So it would require a lot of ocean protection. And this also actually has a road, which would be a whole fun new opening of transportation from Jersey to New York, which becomes a tunnel under the areas where the boats could get through this thing. And I don't know what the cost of that proposal is, but these were all a topic of discussion in 2009 in New York City by the New York Society of the New York Academy of Sciences and the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they put several different models on the table, and Arcadis had a very, it's really chilling now when you read the proposal from Arcadis, because they just say, you have a densely populated region, in the event of a surge, here's what's going to happen, blah, 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 exactly what happened. And of course, between 2009 and now, this could have all been built. And if you look at this next, this is the Bourne Surge Barrier. This is what was built after Katrina. Should have been built before, but it was built after Katrina. This is quite large. I think it's almost 2 miles, this barrier. Next picture. There's a picture here. I'm sorry, it's blurry, but this was a test. You can see the water flowing in and how the locks, how the gates work. And this got its first test, and this is interesting. It was an Army Corps of Engineers project. It was a U.S. project. I think for whatever, probably thanks to budget cuts or whatever, they were not able to, they let it out to a private company. The private company built the thing. They got it done in like less than 3 years, slightly under budget, and it worked perfectly, and it got its first test because in 2011 you had Hurricane Isaac come through, and the barrier was there, and it worked. And New Orleans was not damaged again. So lo and behold, it is possible to defeat nature through scientific progress. And all these crazy people who were saying, well, New Orleans should never be rebuilt, it's too low, it's below sea level. That's the mouth of the Mississippi River. That's a major trading pathway through our whole nation. You're going to say we're not going to have a port at the mouth of the Mississippi River? It's insane. You might as well go to Amsterdam and tell all the Dutch people to leave because the Netherlands is below sea level. I mean, you really think of how brainwashed people have gotten on these things. So the point is, even the fact that this hurricane hit with that force is insane. It's before, during, and after. The whole thing is insane. We never should have been wiped out by this. They knew that it would happen. They projected it even as recently as 2009. The infrastructure could have been built for a fraction of what it will cost to rebuild, and it simply was not done. And there's no agreement that we're going to do it now. Not at this point. And there's no overview plan. I saw the Clinton Foundation tomorrow. They're having a day of action for volunteers. Okay, fine. I think people should volunteer, but why does something of this magnitude, when you have hundreds of thousands of people still displaced, homeless, and rotting in their apartments, why are we depending on volunteers to address this? Now, what we're proposing next, as people may know, is, and this is just an outline of the water, and this is huge. That is the entire continent. And this was a project from the 60s. It was introduced in the Senate. Bobby Kennedy was one of the co-sponsors. It was initiated by Senator Frank Moss of Utah to take water from here. This area in Alaska has an enormous amount of rainfall. It's almost 50% of the rainfall for the whole hemisphere is up there. And what happens is it hits those mountains and it just goes right back into the ocean, into the Pacific or into the Arctic Sea. So the idea is if you divert a mere 11% of that water and you bring it south and you bring it, this here is the Rocky Mountain Trench, which is about 500 miles long. I think there might be 1 or 2 little towns in there. There's not much there. We'd have to move those people. But fill it up. And then what you're looking at is canals through the grain belt of Canada. One of the problems in the 60s, which I think was more severe than it is right now, is the Great Lakes were getting really kind of stagnant and polluted, and they wanted to bring water in through there. Down here, all this stuff in California where you're having fights between the farmers and the cities because they don't have enough water. All of that, there would be no need for squabbling over that. You're talking about the bringing it all the way down to the Rio Grande. So you're talking about power, water, and when you bring water inland, you have a process of transevaporation. That is, the plants consume the water, they evaporate water, you get cloud formation, you get rain, so you get a change in the weather cycle. Like the Imperial Valley is now, I think, 3 degrees Fahrenheit or more cooler than it was when it was a desert, because you're changing the climate. You get about almost 3 times as much water, because when it comes back down, the average raindrop hits land 2.7 times before it goes back into the ocean. So what happens is you're bringing down a certain amount of water, but in effect you're tripling it, because you're using it for irrigation and so on. So you're talking about, now how many people would this kind of thing employ? At the time they projected 4 million just building the project. I suspect right now it would be greater than that, because there are so many things we don't even produce anymore. We have to employ people just getting that back up. It's projected it would take 5 years just to build the railroad grid necessary to get supplies to some of these areas, like Lake Mead, the Hoover Dam. There was nothing there when they began this. So there were new cities, I mean, Las Vegas, for what it's worth, but it would just require a full national mobilization. So you can imagine if we were to launch something like this, launch the projects on the East Coast to build these storm surge barriers, frankly, you'd have a crisis in skilled labor. And one of the things that LaRouche said, which I was somewhat struck by, he said you'd have to come up with new technologies, because you have a younger generation largely who not only are totally unskilled, they are culturally destroyed. They don't have a great deal of incentive to work hard. So what do? You're going to have to take the skilled workforce, which is largely 60 and 70 years old. You're going to have to figure out ways of utilizing what this generation knows. Probably going to have a You're too tired. Oh, you won't be tired when we start this. Anyway, we're going to have to probably get robots. We're going to have all kinds of stuff. And I think my own hypothesis, and we'll see, we'll have to do it to find out, is if the nation has a mission where people actually are working on something really big that's beyond them, a lot of people who aren't interested right now, a lot of younger people who are not motivated, will get interested. Because I know as a kid, I was in 1st or 2nd grade in 72, the 2nd grade, the last time we sent a man to the moon, and every single kid was totally riveted at the age of 6, right? You knew which planet was where, what part of the rocket ship came off when, you knew we had an atmosphere, and everyone was going to be everyone was going to be an astronaut or an engineer or something, because it captured your imagination. And you can think of doing something like this, the idea of greening the desert or developing the Arctic, or if the population has a sense that the nation has a mission, then it's a little bit different. Now, I just wanted to take a minute. I want to show you this beginning of this video. I think we can do it, yeah. This is the documentary, because I want you to reflect on why didn't we do all this stuff? Why did we just stop? And I think this will remind you.
It's an honor and a privilege for me to present to you the President of the United States.
I don't think there is any more valuable lesson for a president or member of the House and Senate than to fly as we have flown today over some of the bleakest land in the United States, and then to come to a river and see what grows next to it, and come to this city, and come to this town, and come to this platform, and know how vitally important water is. that those of us who hold positions of public responsibility in 1962 are as far seeing about the needs of this country in 1982 and 1992 as those men and women were 30 years ago who began to make this project possible. What are we going to do in 1962, beginning today, to determine what projects we should develop so that by the end of this century, when there are 300 million people in the United States, that there will be available to them land and water and light and power and resources and places to live and places to rest and places to work. So we salute this project today, and we salute those who made it possible. And we look to the future, and we look to the past. And we commit ourselves in 1962, not only to celebrate this project, but to move ahead in all the other areas, stretching from California to Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in building this country up. Every member of Congress, everyone in the executive branch, from the president on, in the field of national resources, has to plan during their period of administration or of office for the next generation. Because no project that we plan today will be beneficial to us. Anything we begin today is for those who come after us. And just as those who began something years ago make it possible for us to be here, I hope we'll fulfill our responsibility to the next generation that's going to follow us. Those people who come here from abroad, what they want to see is the Tennessee Valley. 10 years from now, they'll want to see this project. And I hope in space and on the ground, this country will continue its march forward. Thank you. Than to come here to South Dakota and realize here in this state and in this country there is being built the largest dam of its kind in the world. It is a source of pleasure to me as president, therefore, to come here on this occasion. When we are inclined to take these wonders for granted, let us remember that only a generation or two ago, all the great rivers of America, the Missouri, the Columbia, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, ran to the sea unharnessed and unchecked. Their power potential was wasted. Their economic benefits were sparse. And their flooding caused falling.
He'll deliver his message at the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, an institution universally known for the music of its great choir.
When the rain comes 15 or 20 inches a year. This state knows that the control of water is the secret of the development of the West. And whether we use it for power or for irrigation or for whatever purpose, no drop of water west of the 100th parallel should flow to the ocean without being used. And to do that requires the dedicated commitment of the people of the states of the West, working with the people of all the United States who have such an important equity in the richness of this part of the country. We will triple the population of this country in the short space of 60 or 70 years. And we want those who come after us to have the same rich inheritance that we find now in the United States. And I see the closest interrelationship between the strength of the United States here at home and the strength of the United States around the world. There is one great natural development here in the United States which has had in its own way a greater effect upon the position and influence and prestige of the United States almost than any other act we've done. You know what it is? It's the Tennessee Valley. Nearly every leader of every new emerging country that comes to the United States wants to go to New York, to Washington, and the Tennessee Valley, because they want to see what we were able to do with the most poverty-ridden section of the United States in the short space of 30 years by the wise management of our resources. What happens here in this country affects the security of the United States and the purpose of freedom. As I move through the West, and especially in this state and the other states where water is short, I realize that nearly all of the standard of living which we enjoy in this part of the United States has been due partly to our own efforts, the generation which is now here, but really even more to the generation that went before. The people who started in the early 1920s, for example, to organize the distribution of water along the basin. The people who began to talk many years ago about what we're now putting into practice. So water is the key. The management of water, I think, is the key that will open a very bright future. You will only perceive it very slightly in the next few years. But those who come after you, they'll know it, and they'll remember with appreciation. I'm particularly glad because Senator Morse has preached the doctrine of the wise use of water with, I think, more vigor almost than any member of the United States Senate. He's chairman of the Subcommittee on Irrigation and Reclamation. He learned this lesson the hard way, as anyone must who lives here. I come from a section of the country where we waste water, where we seek ways to get rid of it, where we seek to have it go to the ocean as quickly as possible. It's just the reverse here. And therefore, those of us who come from a section where water is in surplus, I think it's valuable for us to come and feel that hot sun and fly over this country and see only on occasion where there are water resources, and then realize how important this project is. But the important thing to remember is for 50 years, men have been talking about this project. It's now a reality. What are we going to do now so that 50 years from now, the people who live in Utah and the United States will feel that in the early 60s, we made the proper decision for the management of our resources. So this is going to make a profound difference to this state. It stands for the final condition of federal state cooperation.
So, 2 months after those last speeches, he was dead. And we had a hideous cultural paradigm shift. The rock, drug, sex counterculture, the environmentalist movement, and a profound pessimism that you can't change anything I'm just one man, I'm just one person, you can't change City Hall, the bad guy always wins, etc. Now, here's something in spite of all of that. People know what this is? That's right, Curiosity rover. So somehow, even with 50 years of total insanity and budget cuts, we managed to produce this absolutely incredible scientific instrument with, all kinds of very exciting technology that had never been used before. Especially, I like that chem-cam where they can, get a spectroscopical analysis of the chemical components of all of the soil, everything that's up there. And just one aspect of this, and there's many, but this was my favorite next, was the whole question of how to land this thing, because it was like 1.5 tons, and it's the size of a minivan. And if you tried to land the rover like they landed our other little rovers on Mars, just with the parachutes, something of this size would still, the slowest they could get it with parachutes was about 200 miles an hour. Now, if everyone here thinks of what it would be like to take a minivan and drive it 200 miles an hour into a wall, you can imagine that all of the delicate machinery on board would not have fared terribly well. The other very complicating aspect is that there's dust. The Martian soil is it's not soil, it's just dust. And you have all these little cameras and lenses and tiny moving parts, and you don't want a thing to come down and make all this dust get in and jam up the works. So they actually had to figure out a way to lower this thing, and they did with this, it's called a sky crane, which is its own rocket, you can see, and what it does is it sort of hovers above the ground, and then you have this cord that lowered this thing down at the speed of about 1 mile an hour, like a baby, just totally gently placed it on the soil, and then this shoots off to the side, so when it crashes, it's far enough away that you don't get dust into the equipment. And the other feature of this, of course, is Mars is 350 million miles, at least the way we're communicating. So at the speed of light, you have about a 14-minute delay. So for the time that this thing has to get through the atmosphere and land, there's actually absolutely nothing that the guys on the ground can do because it's too slow. So the entire thing has to work by all of the computers and automation, its own sensors, everything that was programmed into it. And NASA produced this little movie, which I think was called, I forget, 14 minutes or 7 minutes of terror, where they're all sitting there wondering, did it make it, did it make it? They have no control. There's nothing you can do to intervene, because if you see it going off, it already happened 14 minutes ago, so it's too late. And they did it, and it landed perfectly. And the implications of this are absolutely massive, not just in terms of what you can do for transportation, because, and I know they're already talking about automobiles that can sense everything so that you can prevent wrecks, crashes. I mean, there's just, or high-speed electric rail. I mean, there's a zillion just local, but it also is crucial because of this question I mentioned earlier about the asteroids. There's a whole bunch of these things, we don't even know how many, that are in near-Earth orbit. And the figure given for the smaller ones, like about 30 meters across, like the one that hit in Siberia in 1908 in Tunguska, is just statistically speaking, is about once a century, just knowing how many of them that there are. Now, an asteroid of that size, if anyone's looked at these really nifty pictures on Google of Tunguska, you see the trees, they're just flattened because of the explosion when the thing came through the atmosphere, which was much bigger than a number of nuclear bombs put together. So an asteroid like that coming into New York or San Francisco, it's the end for that area. you get an asteroid like the one that hit probably somewhere down in the Gulf of Mexico around the time the dinosaurs went extinct, you're going to have climate change, you're going to have all this dust in the atmosphere, nuclear winter type situation. It could be extinction of the species. So the Russians, picking up on a proposal that LaRouche gave to Ronald Reagan in '83, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and this is what Dr. Edward Teller and others had in mind, are saying, well, shouldn't we figure out a way to know if an asteroid's going to hit us? Because maybe if we could pick it up far enough away, you'd only have to alter its trajectory by a very, very small fraction of a degree, and we could avoid having this collision. Now, being positioned in Mars would be extremely useful to be able to do that, and you don't have to have a human being there. We're getting an awful lot of data from this little rover, but you could set up some kind of infrastructure there to begin working on this. And you can think, if we were committed to doing this, what would that require? If you go backwards, what would that require for the United States in terms of the level of education, the standard of living, what people do with their spare time? What would a society that had to make this leap be forced to look like? So you wouldn't just be talking about rebuilding New York and New Jersey to some primitive, barbaric era like we had, the infrastructure we have now is like from the 1950s or something. You would say, no, we should be, everything we build now should be with the most modern, advanced level of technology that exists. So you set your sights, and this is what we've been discussing a lot, where LaRouche keeps talking about the future determines the present. That is, you have an objective of where you think that mankind should really be a generation or two from now, and then you fill in the blanks. You don't say, well, here's where we are now. We have a whole bunch of insane young people who are shooting each other and their teachers and are on drugs. And we have insane governors like Chris Christie shutting down nuclear power plants and building solar panels and windmills. And what we're going to just do is build a really big number of solar panels, and somehow we're going to build our way up to get somewhere. It doesn't work that way. You have to have an idea of where you should be, and then the rest falls into place. So the last thing I wanted to discuss was the question of warfare, because great generals and commanders who win battles have that quality of leadership. And I was very struck, especially since I am a Quaker, or raised a Quaker pacifist. And my father was drafted and went to Vietnam, but worked in medical service. I was not an expert on all of the great battles of history. And I decided this is something I really need to know. So I've been doing some work, mostly on the Civil War, but LaRouche kept talking about Incheon and what Douglas MacArthur did there. And this really was incredible. And it's not so much, you can go, yeah, what the landing, which was already quite impossible, it was the question of the leadership that he exhibited, because it was a lot like Washington's Crossing. Incheon is this little, it's on the west side of the Korean Peninsula, and it's surrounded by mud flats, and the tides were 29 feet to 31 feet. So if you got a boat in there at high tide, if you weren't out within a couple hours, you were stuck in just feet and feet of mud until the next tide, which was over 12 hours later. So the thing was extremely difficult, extremely time sensitive. There was a specific day in September when you had the, I think they're called spring tides, which are the highest tides, and it was a 31-foot tide, and it was at 6:59 a.m., and it was September 15th, 1951. And he said, okay, that's when we have to do this. And what happened was Truman, the head of the Joint Chiefs, the head of the Navy, all said, no way. This is insane. It's difficult. We're not going to do it. Forget it. You should land somewhere else. So think about it. These are all the people who are superior in rank to MacArthur. He's supposed to be obeying them, not coming up with some upstart idea of how he's going to win the war. And he describes that in July they had a war council, and you had the head of the Joint Chiefs and the Navy, and various people. So he said, Sherman and Collins finished their arguments. I waited a moment or so to collect my thoughts. I could feel the tension rising in the room. If ever a silence was pregnant, this one was. I could almost hear my father's voice telling me, as he had so many years ago, Doug, councils of war breed timidity and defeatism. His father had been a great Civil War general. Because they all go through all these arguments of why it's impossible, why we shouldn't do it. The guy from the Army said, no, we should land somewhere else. And then MacArthur makes the argument that you have 100,000 U.S. soldiers on the border with South Korea who are basically cut off. They're in a war of attrition. They're just going to keep losing men and losing people unless we can break through the North Korean supply lines and get down to them, and also judo the North Korean army by breaking their supply and communication, and this would do that. So he makes his argument, and he says, I finished, the silence was complete. Then Sherman, an old associate of the Pacific War, rose and said, thank you, a great voice and a great cause. This was July. He doesn't get an answer until August 29th, just a little over 2 weeks before he would have to do this thing. And they said, okay, you can do it. So he gets everyone in there, they're ready to go, they're about to launch this incredibly daring amphibious landing in the mud, or not trying to avoid the mud, get in there at high tide within a 2-hour slot. And he's got all the people ready to go. And then he says, it was at this 11th hour that I received a message from the Joint Chiefs of Staff which chilled me to the marrow of my bones. The message expressed doubt of success and implied the whole movement should be abandoned. So here they are, ready to go. It read in part, quote, we have noted with considerable concern the recent trend of events in Korea. In light of the commitment of all the reserves available to the 8th Army, we desire your estimate as to the feasibility and chance of success. So at this point, he grabs a pencil, scribbles a note which says, I'm totally confident this will work, we have to do it. And then he waits on pins and needles to see if they will get the go-ahead even then. And they finally get it, and then he describes his state of mind as they're on the boat in the pitch black, heading for this area, and he says, within 5 hours, 40,000 men would act boldly in the hope that 100,000 others manning the thin defense lines in South Korea would not die. I alone was responsible for tomorrow, and if I failed, the dreadful results would rest on Judgment Day against my soul. So he personally took it upon himself, because it was in his gut that we had to win the war, but also that he was responsible for 100,000 Americans who really did not have much of a chance if he was not successful, and he was prepared to risk everything. He was at the front on this mission to do it against all public opinion, superior opinion, etc. And I think the reason why LaRouche brings this up, and the reason why this is so crucial, is one, the thing that inspires courage is this question of the future. That is, what makes people small is when you say, well, if I do this, what will happen to me? If I get in a big fight with my mother-in-law about Obama, then what's going to happen to me? Will I get my inheritance? Well, maybe I don't have an inheritance anyway, but, you know, is she going to be nice? Will I get the whatever? And you get smaller and smaller and smaller as you think in terms of the present and about your personal little self. Whereas if you think about, as he was thinking in that case, of these 100,000 soldiers and winning the war, or we think about the fact that there are 7 billion people on the planet today who are dependent on what happens in the United States, and that hopefully there are many billions more people in future generations, then this is what has to shape our actions, and that is what will give us the courage to act today as we have to act in the face of what may seem to be a very difficult popular opinion and popular culture. But as we've seen throughout history, it is never the masses who change anything. It's always a tiny minority who act on principle and who have the courage to do so. So that's what I had.